At the peak of his career, Retief Goosen was once one of the most dependable icons in world golf, a man who could walk into the toughest tournaments and walk out with the highest title without ever needing a single flashy gesture. His two U.S. Open championships in 2001 and 2004 were not just rare achievements, they were proof of a level of class built on almost ruthless precision and an ability to handle pressure that very few of his contemporaries could match. In the early years of the 21st century, as world golf began entering the era of lightning-fast media and theatrical personalities, Goosen remained a classic standard. Quiet, unemotional, yet stable to a frightening degree. He consistently stood among the world's top golfers, regularly contending in major championships, respected by his peers for his ice-cold clutch putting, and nicknamed the Iceman by the American press, a recognition that some people are simply born not to flinch in life-or-death moments. His victories were never loud, never tied to wild celebration images, but they were enduring, and heavy enough to carve his name into the history of modern golf as a true champion. A man who reached the summit through discipline and absolute control. But behind that shell of accomplishments was another life, a quiet existence almost no one saw, where Goosen had to learn how to live with pain and an iron will just to keep from breaking. Behind the cold image on the course was a man accustomed to suppressing emotion, accustomed to never allowing himself weakness, because if he let go even a little, everything could shatter. For many decades, he lived two parallel lives. One public life as a champion who was not allowed to make mistakes, and one private life where injuries, mental exhaustion, and loneliness accumulated day after day. Goosen's true willpower was not measured by how many titles he won, but by the fact that he kept walking onto the course, kept wearing that familiar calm expression, even when inside there were nameless pains and a long, hollow emptiness. Living two lives was not about deception. It was about survival. Goosen chose silence in order to endure. He chose coldness like a suit of armor, and he accepted that the price of becoming a champion sometimes meant trading away the right to fully experience his own emotions. If you want to keep exploring the story behind the icy shell of a champion and understand why Retief Goosen had to live two lives for more than 30 years, please subscribe to the channel and hit like to join us on this journey. Thank you for staying with us until now, and we'll see you in the next part where everything began with the childhood that shaped the man he became. Retief Goosen's childhood did not begin with loud tragedies or losses that immediately brought tears. It began with something quieter, more persistent, the absence of emotional expressions in an environment built on discipline, order, and silence. Born in South Africa, in a structured middle-class family with clear rules, Goosen did not grow up in poverty or instability, but he was also not surrounded by gentleness. Everything had its place there. Schedules, responsibilities, duties, and even the way a child was allowed to exist. Adults did not talk much about feelings. They believed toughness was necessary to survive, that enduring was a skill to be learned early, and that weakness only made people vulnerable in an unforgiving world. In that house, no one intentionally hurt anyone, but no one stopped to ask a child what he was thinking, what he was afraid of, or how he needed to be held. For Goosen, that meant learning a silent lesson very early. Emotions were not something to share, but something to handle alone. When afraid, stay quiet. When sad, get over it yourself. When disappointed, endure. No one said these things out loud, but they were present in every small behavior, every stern look, every brief reminder to toughen up, keep going, do better. The child Retief grew up in that atmosphere without realizing he was gradually forming a dangerous habit, silencing every fear, hiding every tremor, and learning to survive without needing comfort from others. His family was not lacking in material things, but warmth of spirit was rare. Meals happened in order. Conversations were brief. Expectations were clear, but came without encouragement. A child was judged by what he accomplished, not by how he felt. And in that environment, Retief Goosen learned to become obedient, quiet, not troublesome. He did not cry loudly, did not rebel, did not ask questions. He observed, remembered, and adapted. Every time he felt uneasy, he did not seek sharing. He withdrew into himself, trying to control himself more, as if enough discipline would make every uncomfortable emotion disappear on its own. It was during this period that a very special kind of wound began to form. It had no clear shape, no specific event to point to and name, but it seeped in deeply and lasted. It was the wound of a child not allowed to be weak, not allowed to admit he was afraid, sad, tired. It was the wound of growing up without a language for emotions, without a safe space to reveal vulnerability. When a child is constantly taught to be strong, he learns to hide everything that makes him seem not strong. And over time, that hiding stops being a choice and becomes instinct. Goosen did not realize this as a child. For him, it was simply how life worked. But that prolonged silence laid the foundation for a man later famous for his coldness and absolute control. While other children learned to share fears to be soothed, Goosen learned to face them alone, by himself. While others were allowed to fall and get back up with help, he learned to stand straight from the start, because no one would wait or catch him if he fell. The pain in Goosen's childhood, therefore, did not show outwardly. It lay deep inside, quietly accumulating, becoming part of his character. No one saw a wounded child, only a good, calm boy who caused no trouble. But that very goodness was the sign of a child who had early learned to shrink himself to fit the cold expectations around him. And from there, a dangerous habit was formed, living without demanding comfort, existing without allowing himself weakness. Looking back, that childhood left no easy-to-tell tragic memories, but it left a smoldering crack, a hard-to-name emptiness. It is the foundational sadness of Retief Goosen's entire life, a sadness that does not erupt into tears, does not become a story for the press, but quietly shapes how he faces the world. It was from that foundation that his endurance was built, but at the same time, the ability to allow himself weakness gradually disappeared. And as he grew up, stepped into the bigger world, carrying talent and discipline, he also carried something else, quieter but heavier, the habit of living without ever showing fear, even to himself. Golf entered Retief Goosen's life not as a dazzling dream, nor as an escape from poverty or an ambition to become a star. It arrived more quietly, almost by accident, but quickly became the only place where he felt safe. On the golf course, Goosen did not have to explain who he was, did not have to voice what he was thinking, and certainly did not have to prove his emotions to anyone. There, no one asked if he was okay, no one expected a proper emotional reaction. All golf demanded was one single thing: hit the ball from this point to that point, with absolute focus. And for a child already accustomed to silencing fear, that was a rare form of liberation. Golf allowed Goosen to be alone, without being seen as distant. Being alone on the fairway was not isolation. It was the normal state. Being alone before a shot was not avoidance. It was the standard. There was no noise from unnecessary conversations, no scrutinizing eyes on his emotions, no requirement to appear strong or cheerful. Just the wind, the grass, the distance, and a small ball that needed to be sent to the right spot. In that world, Goosen felt for the first time that he did not need to tense up to fit others' expectations. He just had to do one thing correctly, repeat it, and do it better each day. Repetition became the foundation. The same swings, the familiar measured steps, the breathing controlled almost to the point of being mechanical. For Goosen, golf was not a game of inspiration. It was a game of order, and that very order gave him the sense of safety his childhood could not provide. Each time he executed a precise shot. He did not just send the ball in the right direction, he reinforced a quiet belief. If everything is controlled tightly enough, there will be no room for fear to creep in. Gradually, golf ceased to be simply a sport. It became a substitute language for emotions. When he did not know how to express anxiety, he focused on technique. When he did not know how to face unease, he adjusted his stance. When unnameable fluctuations arose in his heart, he returned to familiar, precise movements that allowed no deviation. Each good shot was like a silent answer to the world. I am okay. I am in control. I do not need to say anything more. And over time, using golf as a tool to regulate his inner world became instinct. On the course, Goosen learned to separate himself from his emotions, not because he had none, but because emotions became interference. If he let them show, the shot would stray. If he let them take over, the rhythm would break. Golf taught him that coldness was not a lack of humanity. It was a necessary skill for survival. And for someone already accustomed to an environment that did not encourage emotional expression, this lesson was absorbed so naturally, it was almost frightening. He did not have to try to become cold. He simply continued doing what he had done since childhood, but now with a justified and celebrated reason. The inner detachment began to become clear from here. On the surface, Goosen was a boy who grew increasingly skilled at golf. Calm, focused, unshaken. Inside, he learned to set emotions aside like an unnecessary item for the task at hand. At first, it was a conscious choice, focused to play better. But gradually, it became habit. Emotions were pushed back the moment they appeared. Golf did not teach him how to heal fear. It taught him how to ignore it. And for a long time, that seemed sufficient. A quiet paradox began to form. Golf gave Goosen confidence, discipline, and purpose in life, but at the same time, it reinforced a defense mechanism that had existed since childhood. He felt safest when he did not have to speak, when he did not have to explain, when everything could be resolved through precise action. His most peaceful moments did not come from connecting with others, but from standing alone, preparing for the next shot. And in those moments, he did not realize he was building a separate inner world, where emotions were locked away in exchange for stability. As Goosen grew up with golf, his talent gradually became evident, but alongside technical progress came a narrowing of his ability to express himself. He became accustomed to solving everything through control, accustomed to not needing words. Golf gave him a refuge, but it also unintentionally turned that refuge into a wall that helped him stand firm under pressure, but also blocked him from reaching the fragile parts of himself. And so, from a very young age, Retief Goosen found in golf not just a sport, but a way of life based on silence, precision, and self-control, a way of life that allowed him to survive without directly confronting fear. He did not yet know that this path would lead him to heights very few people reach, but he also could not yet know that this very safe place, over time, would become the foundation for a life lived in parallel between two worlds, the world of perfect control in public and the world of emotions locked deep inside, wordless, with no way out. The accident happened on a day that seemed like any other, a moment that Retief Goosen would later never recount in a dramatic tone, because silence itself was the way he dealt with it. When he was still very young, during what appeared to be a harmless round of golf, the sky suddenly changed color, the air grew heavy, and then a bolt of lightning struck like a slash from above, tearing through the quiet space where he stood. There was no time to be afraid, no moment to brace himself. His body collapsed to the ground, consciousness snatched away in an instant, leaving a thick black void where everything stopped. It was not a painful fall in the usual sense, but a moment when a person was severed from the world, even if only briefly, as if death had touched him and then let go. When Goosen came to, he had survived. His body gradually recovered, The physical wounds healed, and from the outside, the story ended there. A rare accident, an unbelievable stroke of luck, a man who cheated death. But for Goosen, the event did not close so simply, because there are things that leave no marks on the flesh but etch themselves deeply into the inner structure of a person. He was no longer the same young man as before, even though no one could point out the difference with the naked eye. There were no complaints, no public panic, no sleepless nights shared with the press. Everything happened quietly, exactly as he had been taught since childhood. If it hurts, endure it. If you are afraid, stay silent. The fear after the accident did not show outwardly. It did not make him tremble every time clouds gathered, nor did it make him avoid the golf course. On the contrary, Goosen returned quickly, as if to prove to the world that he was unaffected. But that very return was what was terrifying, because instead of facing the near-death sensation, he chose to bury it deep down. The fear was not named, not acknowledged, only pushed into a hidden corner of the mind, where it existed like an underground current, always there but never surfacing. From that moment, a new survival mechanism formed, powerful and unconscious, separating emotion from the experience of living. After the accident, Goosen became more controlled, not because he wanted to become cold, but because control was the only way to feel safe. When death had passed so close, any strong emotion became a threat. Fear could make his hands shake. Anxiety could break his focus. Pain could cause a person to collapse. So instead of allowing them to exist, Goosen learned to neutralize them. He did not tell anyone what he had gone through in that moment of lost consciousness. He did not seek comfort. He simply continued, as if continuing was the only choice. The lightning strike became the pivotal event of his life, not because it nearly took his life, but because it reinforced a dangerous belief that had existed since childhood. Emotions must be controlled absolutely. Before, he had been accustomed to not showing fear because of the cold, disciplined environment. After the accident, that belief was fortified by the near-death experience. If you let go, if you lose control, everything could end in an instant. And from then on, Goosen entered a new state of living, where he not only avoided showing emotions to others, but gradually avoided feeling them even within himself. A subtle change took place that no one noticed. On the golf course, he became calm to an abnormal degree. Shots under pressure no longer made him waver. Moments that frightened others became where he felt clearest. But that clarity did not come from natural confidence. It came from having learned to freeze his emotions. It was not innate strength, but the consequence of a survival mechanism activated too early. Outsiders saw it and called it nerves of steel. Inside, it was a man who had learned to not feel fully in order to avoid further injury. The fear after the accident did not disappear. It was only compressed. It existed as a constant state of alertness, as a need to control everything to the maximum. Goosen did not live in panic, but he also never truly relaxed. Every passing day was a continuation of that guarded state, and the saddest part was that he did not realize he was carrying that burden. To him, this was simply the most effective way to live, the way of living that kept him from collapsing, from trembling, from letting the world see any crack. The lightning strike, therefore, did not become a story retold many times, but it became the invisible line that divided his life into two parts. Before, he was a boy accustomed to silence, because he had been taught that way. After, he was a man silent, because he had learned that silence helped him survive. Death had passed through him in that moment, not taking his life, but leaving a permanent mark. From then on, emotions must be controlled, even eliminated, if he wanted to keep going. And from here, Retief Goosen did not just play golf with technique and discipline, but also with a coldness forged from deeply buried fear. Fear no one saw, but fear that never left him. Entering adulthood, Retief Goosen carried with him everything that had formed inside him throughout the years before. The cold discipline of his family, the habit of silence from a child not allowed to be weak, and the near-death mark from the lightning strike that had taught him emotions were something to be controlled if he wanted to keep surviving. There was no rite of passage. No one sat down to ask how he was feeling on the threshold of adult life. Adulthood arrived as something obvious, and Goosen stepped into it in exactly the way he had learned, carrying it all by himself. At this stage, he was no longer the boy sheltered by the family framework, but he had not yet become a man with emotional support. He was in between, alone, with the feeling that if he did not stand firm on his own, no one would stand with him. No one taught Goosen how to share fear as an adult. No one said that doubting oneself was normal, that anxiety about the future was not a sign of weakness. Every lesson he received revolved around continuing, enduring, doing better. While his peers began talking about dreams, failures, and the early confusions of life, Goosen listened but did not join in. He was not used to putting his emotions on the table, much less used to letting others see the fragile parts inside. For him, silence was no longer a reflex. It had become his identity. The decision to become a professional golfer did not come from a moment of explosive passion or a dazzling vision of glory. It came from familiarity. Golf was the only place he knew how to exist without needing to speak. There, he understood the rules, understood the rhythm, understood that everything could be measured by technique and discipline. When facing the choice of career, Goosen did not seek an emotionally safe path. He sought a space where he could continue living the way he was accustomed. Control, precision, revealing nothing. Becoming a professional golfer, for him, was not just pursuing a career. It was extending a survival mechanism that had formed very early. But along with that decision came a great unnamed fear. Fear of failure. Fear of not being good enough. Fear that if he did not achieve something concrete, he would have no value. That fear was not spoken, not shared, not handled in a healthy way. It existed as a quiet pressure, driving him to train more, control more tightly, be harsher with himself. Goosen did not allow himself to show hesitation, because hesitation meant weakness, and weakness was something he had learned to avoid since childhood. When stepping into the world of professional golf, Goosen soon realized this was not a place for those who needed comfort. The competitive pressure, the unspoken judgments, the scrutinizing eyes on his form, all reinforced the belief that he had chosen the right way to live. No revealing, no complaining, no allowing himself to collapse. But it was precisely in that environment that a separation began to form clearly. One part of him stepped onto the course, performing the role of a calm, precise, emotionless athlete. The other part stayed inside, carrying the fear of failure, mental fatigue, and an ever-deepening sense of loneliness. These two parts existed in parallel, not communicating with each other, not supporting each other, only trying together not to collapse. Goosen began living two layers of life from that point without even realizing it. The outer layer was the image of a serious, disciplined, quiet golfer, always focused on the professional side. That was an image accepted, respected, even admired. The inner layer was a man constantly questioning whether he was good enough, whether one day everything would come crashing down if he did not maintain absolute control. But this inner layer had no place to exist publicly. It was hidden, pushed deep down, because Goosen did not know what else to do but continue. His maturity, therefore, was not tied to a feeling of growing up, but to a feeling of growing heavier. Each step forward in his career came with a new layer of pressure, and each new layer of pressure made him close off his emotions even more tightly. There was never a moment when he stopped to ask himself how he was living. He only knew that if he stopped, everything might break. And for someone who had once felt death so close, that risk was unacceptable. At this stage, Goosen was no longer a child silent because he had been taught that way. He was a man silent because he did not know any other way to survive. Adulthood did not bring him inner freedom. It only reinforced the habit of self-bearing. He walked the path he had chosen with admirable determination, but also with an invisible cost: the ability to allow himself weakness, the ability to share fear, and the ability to seek support from others. And from here, the life of Retief Goosen continued to flow with that momentum. A life built on achievements and willpower, but beneath it, two separate layers of existence quietly running parallel, unseen by anyone, and no one permitted to enter. The nickname the Iceman did not come to Retief Goosen as a choice, but as a label the American media stuck on him after witnessing the same thing many times. A man stepping into the most intense moments of world golf without showing any sign of wavering. While other golfers breathed heavily, frowned, muttered self-reproach, or displayed clear emotions on their faces, Goosen stood there, motionless, eyes flat and calm, movements minimal, as if pressure had no right to touch him. The press called it nerves of steel, the fans called it admirable coldness, and the golf world quickly agreed that Retief Goosen was the Iceman, the man whose hands did not shake, whose heart did not shake, whose mind did not shake. Goosen never actively objected to the nickname. He also did not try to correct or explain it. For him, letting others label him was far easier than having to open his mouth and say the truth that the coldness was not an innate strength, but the result of an entire process of survival. He had been accustomed to silence since childhood. He had been accustomed to burying fear after the near-death accident. And now, when that silence was being interpreted as composure, he had no reason to break the story the world wanted to believe. No denial, no confirmation. Goosen let the Iceman exist as a convenient shell, both protective and allowing him to keep doing what he did best without further explanation. But every time that name was mentioned, a deeper distance was dug inside him. When the media called him cold, they unintentionally legitimized the idea that he did not need to feel. When they praised his composure, they did not know that behind it was a man who had learned to freeze his emotions to avoid being hurt. And when the audience admired his lack of reaction under pressure, no one asked what the price of that lack of reaction was. Goosen heard it all, read it all, but did not react. He was too accustomed to letting the world define him. As long as that definition allowed him to keep surviving without exposing the fragile parts inside. The danger of the nickname the Iceman did not lie in how it was used, but in how it gradually became his official identity. When an image is repeated enough times, it stops being an external description and begins to influence how a person sees himself. Goosen gradually became accustomed to living up to that label. He did not allow himself to show disappointment after a bad shot. He did not allow himself to celebrate too much after a victory. He did not allow himself to admit that there were days he felt tired, confused, or doubtful of himself. Every time an emotion tried to rise, he pushed it down deeper, as if protecting not only his public image, but also the very survival mechanism that had brought him this far. In the world of elite sports, where image and personal stories are increasingly exploited, Goosen chose to stand outside. He did not tell behind-the-scenes stories, did not share sleepless nights, did not talk about the fear of failure. That made him seem more distant in the eyes of the media, but it also made the Iceman more perfect in the public's imagination. A quiet character is always easy to assign the qualities others want to see, and in this case, Goosen's silence was filled with assumptions about nerves, steel, coldness, lack of emotion. In reality, every time Goosen chose silence was every time he gave up the chance to connect with others. But he did not see that as a loss. For him, it was a necessary trade-off. Showing emotion meant opening cracks. And those cracks, if they appeared in a brutally competitive world, could be exploited, exaggerated, or simply misunderstood. Goosen did not believe the golf world had room for vulnerability. So he chose to become perfect by its definition: cold, precise, revealing nothing. It was at this stage that the double life began to become clear, even if it was not yet named. One public life where Retief Goosen was the Iceman, the calm champion, the unshakable man, and another life, existing quietly inside, where he had to constantly suppress emotions, where the fear of failure never disappeared, where loneliness grew thicker with every season. These two lives did not talk to each other. The outer life demanded absolute stability. The inner life demanded total concealment. And Goosen stood in the middle, maintaining that fragile balance with willpower and discipline. Every time the media praised the Iceman, they unintentionally encouraged Goosen to keep living in that shell. No one asked him how it felt to always have to keep an emotionless face. No one asked him if he was tired of having to control himself down to the smallest detail. And Goosen did not ask himself either. He had learned to survive by not asking dangerous questions. He only knew that as long as he could maintain that image, he would still be accepted, still respected, still safe. But inside, the separation grew deeper. Emotions did not disappear. They were only pushed lower. Joy was not allowed to last. Sadness was not allowed to show. Everything was compressed, creating a quiet pressure that he alone carried. Goosen began living like an observer of himself, watching himself stand there, compete, win, be named, but not truly present in those moments. He did everything right, but did not fully feel anything. The Iceman, therefore, was not just a nickname. It was a turning point in Retief Goosen's life. From here, the shell was no longer a temporary tool. It became his identity. And when a person lives too long in an identity created by others, they gradually forget what it feels like to be themselves. Goosen did not lose his humanity, but he learned to put it away, like something luxurious not needed for his career. And it was from this moment that his two-layered life was clearly shaped. One layer for the world to admire, and one layer for surviving in silence, where emotions were imprisoned, wordless, with no way out. The 2001 U.S. Open did not come to Retief Goosen as a life-changing opportunity, but as the final test of everything he had accumulated in silence over many years. From the moment he stepped into the tournament, the pressure was heavier than in any other major. The U.S. Open is not for emotions, not for showmanship. It demands ruthless precision, near inhuman patience, and the ability to endure moments where even the slightest deviation can destroy everything. That was exactly the environment Goosen was familiar with. But familiarity did not mean it was easy. On the contrary, it was like being forced to relive the entire survival mechanism that had formed since childhood, since the near-death accident, since the years of adulthood without any support. Throughout the tournament, Goosen was not the media's favorite, nor was he the name expected to create an inspiring story. He walked quietly among more prominent faces, among big personalities, among those who had entire storytelling teams behind them. But that very quietness was what kept him steady. Each round that passed added a new layer of pressure, and Goosen accepted it in the only way he knew: no reaction, no display, no allowing himself to waver. His shots were not performative, but life or death. Every time the club struck, the ball was another time he reminded himself that emotions were not allowed to interfere. When the tournament entered the decisive phase, everything condensed into a suffocating knot. The pressure came not only from opponents, but also from the history of the tournament itself, from the invisible expectation that only those tough enough could reach that summit. And then, the familiar U.S. Open script unfolded. Goosen entered a playoff, a battle not for those who need release, but for those who can endure one more time. In that moment, many golfers would show tension, fear, or at least a hunger to win. But Goosen did not. He stepped into the playoff with a face that barely changed, as if this was just the next part of a series of tasks to complete. The playoff was so tense that space seemed compressed. Every shot could become the end or the turning point. The crowd held its breath. The media waited for an emotional explosion, a sign of the real person behind the nickname, the Iceman. But it did not happen. Goosen hit the ball with cold precision, step by step, no excess, no shortage. He did not look around for support. He did not seek anyone's eyes for reassurance. He was alone with the ball, with the distance, with the body that had been trained to do exactly what needed to be done in the harshest moments. And then, the championship moment arrived. A moment that for many is the peak of emotion, the explosion after years of dreaming. For Goosen, it was only the conclusion of a long chain of tension. When the victory was confirmed, when the 2001 U.S. Open title officially belonged to him, there was no wild celebration, no screams of release, no tears streaming out. He stood there, amid the roaring cheers of the crowd, but his face retained the familiar calm, as if this victory did not open anything new, but only closed a duty just fulfilled. In the noise of the spectators, Goosen again felt a familiar loneliness. He heard the applause, saw the congratulatory gestures, but it all seemed to happen at a very great distance. His body was present there, but his mind was not truly in the moment. The victory did not bring a sense of release. It did not erase the accumulated pressure, nor did it heal the long-existing wounds. It only confirmed that his survival mechanism had worked effectively once again. To the outside world, the 2001 U.S. Open was undeniable proof of Retief Goosen's greatness. A major champion, a man who stood firm in the toughest test. But for Goosen himself, that moment carried a different meaning, quieter and heavier. It showed him that even when achieving what so many dream of, the emptiness of emotion still did not disappear. He could win without feeling free. He could be celebrated without feeling touched. This victory unintentionally reinforced the double life he was living. On one side, he became the perfect image of the Iceman, the cold man who triumphs under extreme pressure. On the other side, inside him was a person who did not know what to do with his own emotions when there was no longer pressure to resist. The 2001 U.S. Open did not break that shell. On the contrary, it made the shell thicker, stronger, because now the world had one more reason to believe that the coldness was the key to success. After that day, Goosen left the course with the title in hand and absolute respect from the experts. But he also left with an unspoken question. If even the greatest moment of victory brought no release, then what could? He did not seek the answer immediately. He did not stop to reflect. He continued, as he always did, because in the world he had learned to survive in, stopping meant letting emotions flood in, and that was the most dangerous thing. The 2001 U.S. Open therefore became a double milestone in Retief Goosen's life. On the outside, it was the moment he entered golf history as a major champion. On the inside, it was the moment he realized, even if only fleetingly, that victory does not always mean freedom. And amid the cheers of thousands of spectators, he stood there alone, carrying the heavy title, but also carrying the quiet truth that his greatest battle had never taken place on the scoreboard, but deep inside, where no audience could see. After the 2001 U.S. Open, Retief Goosen walked off the course as a major champion, but he did not step into a period of relief as people might imagine. On the contrary, that victory opened up a new layer of pressure, heavier, more subtle, and harder to escape than anything he had ever experienced before. When someone has proven they can stand firm in the harshest moment, the world automatically assumes that person must keep doing the same thing, this time, and many times more. The expectations did not come as threats or public pressure, but through glances, through newspaper headlines, through the way every subsequent shot of his was examined under the lens of a champion. From that moment on, Goosen was no longer allowed to disappear. Before, his silence had been a choice. Now, It became part of an image that had to be maintained. Every time he appeared on the course, he was not just competing against opponents, but against his own title. U.S. Open champion was not a beautiful memory to tuck away. It was a standard hanging overhead, forcing him to reach it or face the disappointment of the entire world. There was no longer any hiding place for the days when he felt tired, doubtful, or simply lacked the energy to control everything as before. Success at this stage meant scrutiny. Every move Goosen made was watched, every round analyzed, every smallest expression on his face could become a clue for others to speculate. The coldness that had once helped him survive was now exaggerated into an indispensable part of the story the media wanted to tell. And the most dangerous thing was that Goosen had no space to escape that story. If he stayed cold, he was only reinforcing the Iceman image. If he showed even a hint of fatigue or disappointment, it would be interpreted as a sign of decline. In either case, he was not permitted to be an ordinary human being. Goosen's inner world began to grow weary, in a way that could not be seen from the outside. Not because he no longer loved golf, but because golf was no longer the refuge it once was. What had once helped him escape emotions now forced him to confront them, even though he was never equipped to do so. Every tournament became a prolonged chain of tension, where he had to constantly remind himself not to make a mistake, not to let go, not to allow anything to break his control. The pressure did not come from one specific failure, but from the constant fear that just one offbeat step could cause the entire image he had built to collapse. At this stage, Goosen began to feel clearly the price of living two layers of life. On the surface, he remained the calm champion, the emotionless man, the symbol of stability. Inside, he was a person increasingly exhausted from having to maintain that stability. Every emotion was pushed down deeper, every doubt extinguished faster, and every time he forced himself to stand firm, he lost another piece of his ability to connect with himself. But he did not stop. He did not know how to stop. From here, his family began to carry the part of his life that no one saw. When Goosen returned home after tense tournaments, he did not bring back brilliant victory stories. He brought back heavy silence. He did not talk much, did not complain, did not say he was tired, but those closest to him felt it. They saw a man who always tried to keep a composed appearance, but who was increasingly absent in spirit. Moments that should have been for rest became silences filled with pressure, because Goosen did not know how to unload what he had been carrying all day on the course. His family became the place where he was allowed to exist without having to prove anything, but at the same time, it was also the place that had to endure that invisible distance. They did not face anger or emotional outbursts. They faced a quiet withdrawal. Goosen did not hurt anyone directly, but his half-presence created a void that was hard to fill. He was there, but not fully there. And this was what made the burden of success spread beyond the golf course, slowly seeping into his private life. At the peak of his career, Goosen began to realize that success did not bring the safety he once believed. On the contrary, it took away the small spaces where he could once hide. Before, a bad round could be overlooked, an unsuccessful tournament could be forgotten. Now, everything was placed in the context of a champion. Every mistake became heavier. Every dip in form was magnified. And in that world, Goosen had no other choice but to keep holding tightly to the shell that had brought him this far, even though the price grew larger every day. The peak, therefore, was no longer a place to stand and admire the view. It became a burden to carry. It forced Goosen to live in a state of constant alertness, not allowing himself to weaken even a little. What had once been motivation now became pressure. What had once been a refuge now became exposure. And in that process, he gradually came to understand a painful truth. Sometimes, achieving what you pursue does not bring freedom. It only changes the form of the prison. At this stage, Retief Goosen continued to compete, continued to hold the respect of the experts. But inside, a profound fatigue had begun to form. It did not erupt into a crisis, did not lead to sudden decisions. It only grew quietly, day by day, tournament by tournament, return home after return home, in silence. And it was in that very silence that his two-layered life became clearer than ever. One layer for the lights and expectations, and one layer for the quiet endurance that only his family fully felt. The 2004 U.S. Open came to Retief Goosen not as a journey in search of validation, but as a confrontation with the very last limits of himself. 3 years after his first victory, he entered this tournament in a completely different position. No longer the quiet challenger, but a recognized champion, a standard by which others measured toughness. On paper, this was a chance to prove that the 2001 U.S. Open was not a one-off stroke of luck. In reality, it was a piled-on pressure, because now he was not just competing to win, but to defend his own image. From the early rounds, Goosen displayed the familiar icy stability. No showmanship, no impulsiveness, each shot executed like a calculation that had been solved and resolved in his head many times over. The experts looked on and saw a more mature, more composed, more seasoned champion. But inside, Goosen felt something very different. The fatigue had taken deep root. Not fatigue from form, but fatigue from having to keep everything under absolute control. Each round that passed did not bring him closer to joy. It was just one more step in a chain of tasks that needed to be completed. As the tournament drew toward its conclusion, the familiar script repeated itself. Goosen found himself in the lead group again. Again the tense moments. Again the shots, where even the tiniest mistake could destroy everything. But unlike in 2001, there was no longer the sharpness of someone pouring every ounce of energy into overcoming the challenge. Instead, there was a strange sense of emptiness, as if he were repeating something he had already done before, no longer with excitement, and no longer with fear strong enough to generate adrenaline. The pressure was still there, but the emotions had gradually drained away. The victory moment in 2004, therefore, carried a very different tone. When Goosen officially became the U.S. Open champion for the second time, the world looked on and saw a rare achievement, a summit very few golfers in history had reached. 2 U.S. Opens, in one of the toughest tournaments, was an undeniable mark of class. But for Goosen, that moment did not open a new door, nor did it bring a sense of fulfillment. It was like placing another trophy on a table that was already full, without knowing why he needed that trophy. There was no explosive joy. There was no moment of release. If any emotion appeared at all, it was a fleeting sense of relief, not because he had achieved something, but because another stretch of tension had ended. Goosen did not stand there to savor the victory. He stood there to breathe, to feel that at least in this moment, he did not have to keep trying anymore. But that relief passed very quickly, giving way to a more familiar feeling: emptiness. Proving his class a second time brought no healing. On the contrary, it forced Goosen to face head-on a hard-to-accept truth. Titles had no power to fill the voids inside him. If the first victory still carried the shape of a challenge overcome through sheer willpower, the second victory felt like cold proof that he could do this forever, without feeling anything more than exhaustion. That made him realize the problem was not that he had not achieved enough, but that no finish line in golf could bring the sense of wholeness he was missing. After the 2004 U.S. Open, Goosen walked away with his reputation strengthened. But his inner world went in the opposite direction. 2 major titles did not free him from the Iceman shell. They locked it even tighter. Now the world not only expected him to be steady, but believed that coldness was his very nature. No one asked whether he still had motivation. No one asked whether he still found joy in winning. And Goosen did not speak. He continued to stay silent, because silence was the only way he knew to survive in the image he himself had helped create. The emptiness became more evident in the days after the victory. When he returned from the tournament, when there was no longer a packed schedule to occupy his mind, Goosen faced an uncomfortable void. He had achieved what very few people ever do, yet he felt no lasting relief or happiness. Quiet evenings did not bring rest. They caused questions that had never been asked before to start appearing. If winning did not bring joy, then what could? And if there was no answer, how long would he keep going on momentum? The 2004 U.S. Open therefore became a milestone full of paradox. It elevated Retief Goosen's career to an indisputable position in golf history, but at the same time, it marked the point when he began to run out emotionally. Not a collapse, not a public crisis, but a quiet erosion. A man who continued to win, continued to be celebrated, but felt less and less meaning in what he was doing. The second victory did not bring light. It only revealed the darkness inside more clearly. Goosen understood that he had proven enough to the world. But what he had never done, and did not know how to do, was prove to himself that this life was not just a series of tasks to complete. When the cheers of the 2004 U.S. Open died down, what remained was not a lasting sense of pride, but a profound fatigue, as if he had gone too far down the path of control to the point where he no longer knew how to turn back. And from here, though the titles still shone brightly, Retief Goosen's journey began to take on a different color, the color of silent exhaustion, signaling that the years ahead would no longer be a race against opponents, but a fight against the emptiness inside himself. After the 2004 U.S. Open, when the titles were enough to affirm his class and there was nothing left to prove to the world, Retief Goosen began to enter a different phase of his life, where the enemy was no longer pressure or expectations, but his own body. The pains did not come in a rush. There was no clear moment of collapse that people could easily name. They came slowly, quietly, just as everything had always happened in Goosen's life. At first it was back pain that appeared after long rounds, then the wrists, where the repeated swings began to leave their mark. Not serious injuries that forced him off the course immediately, but persistent, lingering pain, enough to wear him down, but not enough to make him stop. For Goosen, stopping had never been an easy choice. He was accustomed to living in a state of endurance, accustomed to seeing pain as an inevitable part of existence. When his body began to betray him, he did not see it as a signal to be listened to, but as a new challenge to overcome. The pains were hidden, handled in silence, with medication, with technique adjustments, with more careful training. There were no complaints to the media, no press conferences full of grievances. Goosen continued to step onto the course with the familiar calm face, as if his body still functioned perfectly as before. But inside, things were no longer the same. Every round now was not just a battle against opponents and pressure, but a constant negotiation with his own body. Every shot came with a silent question. Will the back hold up? Will the wrist respond? Movements that once happened unconsciously now became heavy, requiring more calculation. Golf, the sport that had once given him a sense of absolute control, now began to resist that very control. And the most frightening thing was not the pain itself, but the feeling of losing trust in his own body. Goosen did not talk about this. He did not know how to, and he also did not see the need to. In the world he was familiar with, pain was something to endure, not something to share. But that silence came at a cost. As his body wore down more and more, his spirit began to be affected too. The icy confidence that had once kept him steady under pressure was now eroded bit by bit. Not because he doubted his talent, but because he was no longer certain he could maintain the level of control his career demanded. The prolonged pain made Goosen more cautious, more restrained. He began to avoid unnecessary risks, not because he lacked the desire to win, but because his body no longer allowed him to be as daring as before. This unintentionally revealed a hard-to-accept truth. Time was passing, and no layer of coldness was thick enough to stop the natural wear and tear of the human body. For someone who had built his entire life on the foundation of control, even a partial loss of control was a heavy mental blow. The body's betrayal was not just physical. It brought a crack in the relationship between Goosen and himself. He had once believed that with enough discipline, enough willpower, everything could be overcome. But now, he had to face a limit that could not be negotiated. Not some opponent on the course, but the very biological structure of himself. This forced him to admit, however reluctantly, that there are things that cannot be controlled by willpower. And for Goosen, that was a more painful truth than any injury. His spirit wore down in a way very similar to his body. No collapse, no explosion, just a quiet decline. The accumulated fatigue was not released, because Goosen had no habit of releasing it. He continued to live 2 layers of life, but now both layers were under pressure. The public layer demanded that he maintain the image of stability, calm, showing no signs of weakness. The inner layer had to face the growing fear that his body was no longer an absolute ally. Caught between those 2 layers, he stayed stuck, continuing to move forward because he did not know what else to do. Those around him might notice the change, but it was very hard to name. Goosen was still Goosen, quiet, disciplined, not loud, but there was a new heaviness in the way he moved, in the rhythm of his play, in the preparation for each shot. It was the sign of a man trying to adapt to a body that no longer responded as before. And each time he adapted like that, he had to sacrifice another piece of inner freedom, another piece of the comfort he once had on the golf course. The irony was that Goosen's very silence made this process happen in isolation. If he complained, if he allowed himself to show weakness in public, perhaps the pressure would lessen. But he did not do that. He continued to hold the image, continued to endure in silence, as if that was the only way he knew to protect his dignity. And in that process, body and spirit wore down together, in parallel, without a sound. The most painful part was not that Goosen no longer played at the peak as before, but that he had to accept the truth that even the tools that had helped him survive for so many years were no longer reliable. Golf had once been the place where he found safety. His body had once been something he could rely on to do everything he wanted. When both began to betray him, he stood before a new void, where there was not much left to hold on to. The body's betrayal marked a quiet turning point in Retief Goosen's life. No retirement announcement, no public moment of collapse, but an irreversible change. From here, every step he took carried the awareness that everything has limits. And for someone who had lived his entire life by denying the limits of emotion, having to face the limits of the body was a profound blow, forcing him to slow down, even though he was not ready for it. When his body began to betray him, and his spirit no longer had the strength to maintain absolute control as before, Retief Goosen gradually realized that there was one single space in his life where he did not need to tense up to survive. That was his family. Not the golf course, not the gym, not the big and small tournaments spread across the world, but the home he returned to after long trips, where there were no scoreboards, no cameras, no scrutinizing eyes. There, Goosen was not the Iceman, not the 2-time U.S. Open champion, but simply a husband, a father, with all the limitations he had spent his entire life hiding. In his family, he did not need the shell. He did not need to keep the calm face. He did not need to prove his composure, did not need to control every emotional reflex. But this did not mean he suddenly became easy to express or confess. Goosen's weakness did not come in the form of tears or long confessions. It came in the form of fatigue, clearly visible in his eyes, in the form of longer than usual silence, in the form of evenings when he sat quietly, no longer having enough energy to maintain the familiar hardness. The family was the only place where those expressions were not misunderstood, not judged, not turned into a story. His wife and children did not need him to explain why he spoke so little, why he brought home that invisible heaviness after every tournament. They did not demand that he recount what happened on the course, nor did they require him to become a different version of himself. Their presence alone was enough to create a safe space, where Goosen could exist without having to play any role. And it was that unconditional acceptance that made the family the place that absorbed the pain he had never allowed himself to process publicly. The family carried what the world did not see. The nights he could not sleep because of lingering back pain. The days he came home with an exhausted spirit, but still tried to stay silent. The moments he sat staring into the distance, as if he were somewhere very far away, even though his body was still in the room. They did not press him with questions, did not force him to say anything. They understood that for someone who had lived his entire life through control, being allowed to be silent beside others was already a rare form of trust. The love in the Goosen family was not loud, not showy, not needing grand declarations. It existed in small actions. A meal prepared and ready when he returned, an understanding look when he did not want to talk, a respect for the silence he needed to rebalance himself. The family did not try to fix him, did not try to pull him out of his silence, but accepted that the silence was part of who he was. And that very acceptance gave Goosen a sense of safety he had never found anywhere else. With his family, Goosen allowed himself to slow down in a way the golf course never permitted. He could sit still without having to think about the next round. He could listen without needing to respond immediately. He could be present without having to control every detail. It was not complete healing, but it was a rare breath, a place where he was not required to be strong. The sad thing is that Goosen never said outright how his family had saved him. He did not use grand words to describe their role in his life. But that very quietness reflected exactly the way he loved. No need for declarations, no need for proof. The family was the only place he allowed himself to weaken, even though that weakness remained very discreet, and it was also the only place he did not feel ashamed for it. While the world continued to see him as an icon of coldness and composure, his family saw a different person, more tired, more fragile, but also more real. They did not need him to win, did not need him to maintain the image. His presence alone was enough. And in the years when his body wore down more and more, when his spirit grew heavier, this was exactly what kept Goosen from completely collapsing. The family did not erase the physical pains, nor did it resolve the inner voids that had formed over decades of living two lives. But they created the only anchor, the place where Goosen did not have to freeze his emotions to survive. There, he was allowed to be an imperfect human being, a man who had gone through too much pressure and no longer had the strength to keep everything intact. And perhaps that was the deepest form of love Goosen had ever experienced. Not the cheers of the crowd, not the titles engraved in history, but the shared silence, the unconditional presence, and the feeling that no matter how the world saw him, there was still one place where he was allowed to let go of the shell that had followed him his entire life. As Retief Goosen gradually slowed down because of the limits of his body and the accumulated fatigue in his mind, the world around him also changed in a way that needed no prior announcement. The era of Tiger Woods erupted like an earthquake, not only altering the landscape of professional golf, but also changing the way the media chose stories to tell. Golf was no longer just a sport of technique and endurance. It became a stage for glamour, personality, power, and global icons. In that flow, quiet figures like Goosen gradually became harder to see. The media shifted direction very quickly, almost ruthlessly. The headlines once reserved for the Iceman grew fewer, then disappeared. Technical analyses of his icy stability were no longer captivating in an age when the public craved explosive shots, dramatic personal stories, and characters who could dominate the mainstream cultural space. Goosen was not criticized, not attacked, but he was forgotten, and that silence was sometimes heavier than open criticism. Goosen noticed the change very clearly, but he did not resent it. He had never believed the world owed him attention. For him, a golf career had never been an emotional contract with the public. He had done what he could do, reached heights very few people touched, and the rest belonged to the natural flow of the era. If the world needed new icons, he accepted stepping back. No resistance, no clinging. That acceptance did not come from serenity. It came from a long-standing habit, being used to standing outside the spotlight, used to not being asked about, used to existing without needing to be seen. But not resenting it did not mean he felt nothing. As invitations grew scarce, as interviews no longer came regularly, as his name no longer appeared on the front pages of sports newspapers, a different kind of loneliness began to form. Not the loneliness of failure, but the loneliness of someone who had once been very close to the center and now stood on the sidelines with no rite of passage. Goosen had no clear moment of farewell to the glory. He simply was no longer there. In the story the world was telling, the Tiger Woods era did not just bring a superior star. It created a new standard for greatness. In that standard, Goosen's quiet coldness became hard to place. He did not fit as a media foil, did not fit as background for dramatic rivalry stories, and so he was gradually pushed out of the main current, not because he was inferior, but because he did not belong to the new era. Goosen observed it with an outward calm, but inside, the feeling of disconnection grew more and more distinct. Golf had once been the place he found meaning, then became the place he had to endure, and now was the place he was no longer mentioned. Those three phases overlapped, creating an emptiness hard to name. He was no longer under pressure to win at all costs, but he also no longer felt that his presence mattered to the outside world. The loneliness in this phase was deeper than anything he had experienced before. Earlier, he was lonely because he had to maintain the shell. Later, he was lonely because success left him no place to hide. Now, he was lonely because he was no longer called by name. No one demanded that he be strong anymore, but no one asked how he was living either. And Goosen, out of habit, did not speak up on his own. He did not tell his story, did not try to remind the world of himself. He let everything pass, as if being forgotten was also an inevitable part of the journey. In that silence, the family once again became the only anchor. When the world turned its back, not with hostility, but with indifference, those closest to him were still there. They did not need him to be a champion, did not need him to represent an era. This was both comforting and made the contrast even sharper. Outside, he gradually became a name from the past. Inside the family, he remained a man learning to slow down with what was left. Goosen did not resist the flow of the era, but that withdrawal was not light at all. It happened in silence, with no recognition, no thank you, no official milestone where he could say, "It's over." Instead, he lived in a state of suspension, where the old glory had faded and a new meaning had not yet formed. And it was in that very state that the loneliness became deeper than ever, not because he was alone, but because the world had moved on without looking back. The most painful part of being forgotten was not the lack of attention, but that it forced Goosen to face the question he had avoided his entire life. If there were no more titles, no more lights, no more role in golf's big story, then who was he? Before, he could hide in his career, hide in control, hide in the shell. Now, as all those things gradually slipped from his grasp, he stood before a void that no skill on the golf course could help him fill. When the world turned its back, Retief Goosen did not collapse, did not rage, did not blame. He simply stepped deeper into the loneliness that had followed him from very early on, carrying a different kind of fatigue. The fatigue of a man who had lived too long in silence and now had to learn how to exist when even that silence was no longer noticed. When the stage lights had dimmed, when his name was no longer called every week, Retief Goosen was forced for the first time to confront what he had avoided for more than 30 years. Himself. Not the champion, not the Iceman, not the icon of coldness under pressure, but the human being existing behind all those roles. Before, he had never had the time or the courage to look back. Everything had always been filled with tournaments, schedules, expectations, physical pain, and constant control. But when the world slowed down, when there was nothing left to cling to on the outside, the silence became different. It was no longer a safe refuge. It became a mirror, forcing him to look into it. For the first time, Goosen began to realize that his life had never been a straight line, but two parallel streams existing at the same time. One person for the world to see, calm, precise, cold, emotionless, always ready to endure any pressure without complaint. That person was carefully built, maintained through discipline, reinforced by the media with labels like the Iceman, and protected by his own absolute silence. It helped him win, helped him survive in the harshest environment, helped him not be crushed by expectations. But running parallel to that was another person, rarely acknowledged, even rarely named by himself. A person who lived to survive, not to be seen. That person carried the fear formed from a childhood not allowed to be weak, from the deeply buried near-death accident, from the years of adulthood without support. That person knew fatigue, knew pain, knew emptiness, but had no language to express it. It only knew how to continue, because stopping meant everything could shatter. While those two people were still clearly separated by the tournament schedule and the glory, Goosen could maintain the fragile balance. But when the lights went out, that boundary began to blur. He could no longer easily escape into the public role to avoid the person inside. The long silences forced him to spend more time with himself, and in those silences, the fatigue appeared raw. Not fatigue from failure, but fatigue from having to maintain two versions of himself for far too long. Goosen began to understand that his double life was not deception, but a survival strategy. He did not deliberately hide to fool anyone. He simply did not know any other way to live in a world with no room for vulnerability. One person for the world to see was designed not to tremble. One person for survival was designed to endure in silence. The problem was that those two people had never been allowed to become one. They existed side by side, draining each other, and ultimately leaving a profound exhaustion he could no longer ignore. This feeling of fatigue did not erupt into a crisis, did not lead to dramatic decisions. It was present as a persistent emotional undercurrent, following him through every passing day. Goosen no longer had the energy to maintain the cold image automatically. He also did not have enough relief to completely let it go. He stood in the middle, more aware than ever that both of those people were him, and denying either one meant continuing to hurt himself. In this first real look back at himself, Goosen did not feel pride, nor did he feel regret in the usual way. What he felt most clearly was the wear and tear. The wear and tear of a man who had lived too long on survival mechanisms, to the point of forgetting what it felt like to live fully. He understood that the victories, the titles, the moments of celebration were all real, but he also understood that the price paid was very high. The ability to connect with his own emotions. The double life came into view not as a secret exposed, but as a truth that could no longer be denied. Goosen began to accept that he had lived this way for more than 30 years, not by choice, but because of circumstances and unhealed wounds. This acceptance did not bring immediate release, but it opened a new possibility, the possibility of no longer having to freeze his emotions to survive. At this stage of his life, Goosen did not try to rewrite the past, nor did he try to justify it. He simply quietly acknowledged that he had done everything he could with what he had. And perhaps, for the first time, He allowed himself to be tired without feeling ashamed of it. The double life was no longer something to hide. It became part of the story, part of who he was, viewed not with judgment, but with belated understanding. When Retief Goosen moved into the next phase of his life, he did not call it a rebirth. There was no cinematic moment of awakening, no decisive decision to start over, no declaration that everything from here would be different. For Goosen, that was too foreign. He simply kept living, and that very humble choice reflected most clearly who he was at this point. A man who no longer needed to prove anything to the world, but who also did not deny his past. Moving to the Champions Tour did not mean a decline. It was a necessary adjustment. There, the pressure was no longer destructive. The competition still existed, but did not demand total sacrifice as it had at the peak. Goosen entered this environment with a different mindset. He was not seeking big headlines, not chasing proof that he could still compete with the younger generation. He came to play golf in the way his body and mind allowed, no more, no less. On the Champions Tour, Goosen no longer had to maintain the Iceman shell so absolutely. Not because he had completely changed, but because the environment no longer forced him to do so. Those around him had all been through the peak. They all understood the cost of a career spanning decades. There, no one needed to prove who they were through coldness or defiance. Dignity came from how a person showed up, not from how much pressure they could still endure. Goosen began to allow himself to play golf with less tension, not less seriously, but without treating every round as a test of survival. He listened to his body more, accepted off days without punishing himself. This was a small change, but for someone who had lived his entire life by denying limits, it carried great meaning. For the first time, he allowed himself to be imperfect while still holding respect for himself. It was in this phase that the double life began to gradually merge, not through a complete welding, but through a reduction of conflict. The person for the world to see, and the person for survival, no longer had to pull against each other until exhaustion. Goosen no longer needed to perform an overly rigid role in public, nor did he have to completely hide the fatigue inside. Those two parts began to exist side by side more gently, no longer draining each other as before. This merging did not bring explosive joy, but it brought a quiet kind of peace. Goosen no longer lived in a state of constant alertness. He could step onto the course without feeling he was betting his entire self-worth on the outcome. He could return home without carrying the burden of maintaining an image. And though emotions were still not something he easily expressed, he no longer had to pour all his energy into suppressing them. Continuing to live, for Goosen, did not mean forgetting the years that had passed, but accepting that they had shaped who he was. The accident, the pressure, the victories, the being forgotten, all of it was real. He did not try to rewrite the story to make it prettier. He simply chose to move forward with more honesty toward himself. And that honesty showed in the fact that he no longer forced himself to be a symbol of anything. In this phase, dignity became the central value. Not the dignity of the winner, but the dignity of a man who understood his own limits and respected them. Goosen no longer needed to prove he could endure as he once did. He had endured enough. What he needed now was to keep what remained from being worn down further. The double life did not disappear completely, but it was no longer a burden. It became part of his personal history, viewed with understanding rather than denial. Goosen no longer had to live. Separated between two versions of himself, he allowed them to exist together, even if imperfect, even if there were still silences left unfilled. And perhaps it was here that Retief Goosen found the closest thing to peace he had ever known. Not a dazzling rebirth, not a bright new chapter, but the ability to keep living without hurting himself further. A slower life, less demanding, but more honest. For a man who had lived too long in silence and endurance, that was not a small ending. It was a different kind of victory, one that needed no audience, no cheers, but enough to let him keep walking with his head held high and a heart just a little lighter than before. When the story returns to the present, Retief Goosen is not standing in the middle of a golf course under blinding lights, nor is he still a name called out, with the excitement of tens of thousands of spectators. He appears in a much quieter scene, a man who has gone through nearly the entire journey of his life, walking more slowly, speaking less, and no longer feeling the need to explain what happened. There is no complete redemption here. No moment when all the wounds are erased, all the voids filled. Goosen's life does not close with a neat, rounded ending, because from the very beginning, it was never built to be an easy story. There is no glorious comeback in the way the world usually expects, no dramatic return to remind everyone how great he once was. The titles are still there. The 2 U.S. Open trophies remain undeniable facts, but they are no longer the center of the story. They have become past milestones, memories that carry more weight than joy. Goosen does not try to polish his image again. He also does not try to explain why he stayed silent for so long. He leaves everything in its place, like a man who has understood that some parts of life cannot be edited or replayed. What remains, when all the shells have thinned, is not a legend, but an aging man, a human being carrying the marks of time, of injuries that are not only in the body, but also in the mind. Goosen no longer chases the tournament schedule, no longer lives in a state of constant alertness. He lives more slowly, more selectively, and more silently in a different way. Not silence to hide, but silence of acceptance. His family is still there, as the final and most enduring anchor, not as a miraculous cure, but as a steady, unconditional presence. With his family, Goosen does not need to be the champion, does not need to be strong, does not need to prove he has overcome everything. He only needs to be present. And in that presence, there is a very humble but real kind of peace. The family does not erase the years of loneliness, but they make the remaining years not completely empty. The respect Goosen receives in this phase does not come from newspaper headlines or cheers. It comes late, quietly, and with little fanfare. It is the respect of those who understand that not all greatness is shown through noise, that some people have carried too much in silence, and the fact that they still stand is an achievement. Goosen is not remembered as the man who changed the face of golf, but he is seen as someone who endured with rare persistence. His story does not end with a final victory, nor does it conclude in tragedy. It pauses in a very human middle ground. A man who survived spiritual poverty, a near-death accident, peak pressure, being forgotten, and himself. Not everyone who survives becomes more radiant. Some survive by accepting that life will never be completely light. Goosen is one of those. When looking back at the entire journey, people can easily list the titles, the milestones, the cold moments under pressure, but if you look more closely, what matters most is not in the record book, but in the fact that he did not collapse. He lived 2 parallel lives for more than 30 years, not to deceive the world, but to survive in a world with no room for vulnerability. And finally, when he no longer had to run, he allowed those 2 lives to stand side by side, even if they did not fully merge. Retief Goosen is not completely redeemed. He is also not given back glory as a late reward. But he has something not everyone has, the right to keep living without hurting himself any further. In the quiet of the present, he is no longer the Iceman, in the way the world once called him. He is just a man who has walked through the hardest part of the road, with the rest being slow steps, with family, with memories, and with a respect that arrived late, but deep enough not to need to be spoken aloud. The story of Retief Goosen does not make people cry over a loud tragedy, but over a quiet sadness that lasted an entire lifetime. The most heartbreaking thing is not the back or wrist injuries or being forgotten by the media when the Tiger Woods era exploded. but that Goosen learned how to live without allowing himself weakness far too early. From childhood, in a cold, disciplined family, he was not asked about emotions. To the near-death lightning strike, he buried the fear deep. Then, entering professional golf, he used absolute control to survive. The two U.S. Open championships in 2001 and 2004, those peaks that all of America admired, did not bring release, but only made the Iceman shell thicker, leaving him standing alone amid the cheers. The greatest pity lies in the double life he had to maintain: a cold, composed person for the world to see, and a tired, enduring person inside to survive. When his body betrayed him and the world turned away, only his family remained as the place he was allowed to be weak, the place that absorbed the pain he never spoke of. That is what makes Goosen worthy of respect, not because he was unbeatable, but because he did not collapse, even when exhausted. The lesson for the American people from this story is very clear and very American. Success does not always heal, and true strength is not in never falling, but in knowing when to slow down, knowing how to keep dignity without destroying oneself. American society celebrates willpower, competition, and victory. But Goosen reminds us that without space for vulnerability and family connection, victory can become a form of loneliness. Honor him, because in the end, he is not just a U.S. Open champion, but a man who survived himself. If the story of Retief Goosen makes you pause and look differently at the price of success, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like so we can continue telling real journeys like this. Thank you for staying until the very end, and see you in the next video where we continue to explore great people, not because they are perfect, but because they survived themselves.